Something fundamental just shifted in the power structure of the Western alliance, and most people completely missed it. Washington has quietly told Brussels, "You're on your own." After pumping over $175 billion into Ukraine since 2022, the United States is now stepping back, and Europe is being handed a bill it never prepared to pay. This isn't just about money. This is about the unraveling of a geopolitical strategy that was supposed to weaken Russia, strengthen NATO's eastern flank, and preserve American dominance in Europe. But here's what they're not telling you. The economic reality behind this decision reveals a deeper crisis. America's own fiscal situation is becoming unsustainable, with debt servicing costs now exceeding defense spending. Meanwhile, Europe is facing deindustrialization, energy dependence, and political fragmentation. The question isn't whether Ukraine can survive without American funding. The question is whether the entire Western strategy in Eastern Europe is about to collapse. And if it does, the global order we've known for 80 years collapses with it. Let's break down what's really happening here. Now, to understand what's really unfolding, we need to step back and look at the architecture of this entire operation from the beginning. When this conflict started, the Western narrative was remarkably unified and simple. Russia was the aggressor, Ukraine was the innocent victim defending democracy, and the collective West had a moral obligation to support Kiev for as long as it takes. That phrase, "as long as it takes," became almost a mantra. You heard it from Biden, from Stoltenberg, from von der Leyen, from Scholz. It was repeated so often that it became an article of faith, a commitment that seemed absolute and unbreakable. But here's the thing about political commitments in the modern era. They're only as solid as the economic foundation supporting them, and that foundation has been crumbling for quite some time now. Let me walk you through the numbers because they tell a story that the mainstream press simply refuses to acknowledge. The United States has provided the lion's share of support to Ukraine. We're talking about military aid, financial assistance, humanitarian relief, intelligence sharing, training programs, and logistical support that doesn't even appear in official budget lines. The official figure of $175 billion is almost certainly an undercount when you factor in the classified operations, the CIA activities, the special forces deployments, and the indirect costs of maintaining this entire apparatus. Meanwhile, the European Union, despite being geographically closer to the conflict and theoretically having more at stake, has contributed significantly less. Yes, individual countries like Poland and the Baltic states have been generous relative to their GDP, but the big economic powers in Europe, Germany, France, Italy, have been notably more restrained. This disparity created an uncomfortable dynamic from the start. America was essentially underwriting Europe's security policy, again, which is nothing new historically, but the context here is dramatically different from the Cold War era. During the Cold War, the United States had a clear strategic interest in defending Western Europe from Soviet expansion. The American economy was the dominant force in global manufacturing, innovation, and finance. The dollar's supremacy was unquestioned, and the United States could afford to run substantial deficits because the entire world needed dollars to conduct international trade. Fast forward to today, and every single one of those conditions has either changed dramatically or is actively deteriorating. The American economy is now financialized rather than industrialized. We don't make things anymore. We make financial instruments. Our manufacturing base has been hollowed out over decades of globalization, outsourcing, and the pursuit of short-term quarterly profits over long-term strategic resilience. The national debt has exploded to over $36 trillion, and the interest payments on that debt are now consuming an ever larger share of the federal budget. Think about that for a moment. We're spending more money just servicing our existing debt than we spend on national defense. That's not a sustainable trajectory. That's the profile of an empire in terminal decline. Meanwhile, the dollar's role as the global reserve currency is being challenged in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. The BRICS nations are actively working on alternative payment systems. Saudi Arabia is now willing to sell oil in currencies other than dollars. China and Russia have dramatically reduced their dollar holdings and are conducting bilateral trade in their own currencies. The sanctions weapon, which was supposed to be America's ultimate tool of coercion, has been so overused that it's actually accelerating the very de-dollarization process that Washington fears most. Every time the United States freezes another country's assets or cuts them off from SWIFT, it sends a clear message to every other nation. Holding your reserves in dollars and routing your transactions through American-controlled systems is a strategic vulnerability. So here we have the United States facing mounting domestic economic pressures, watching its global financial dominance erode, and simultaneously trying to fund a proxy war in Eastern Europe that has no clear end game and no realistic path to victory. And this is where the political calculation starts to shift. The American public is tired. They're tired of forever wars, tired of sending billions overseas while infrastructure crumbles at home, tired of being told that Ukraine's borders are more important than their own. The political winds are changing, and politicians, whatever else you might say about them, are very good at reading those winds. Now let's talk about Europe's predicament, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Europe went into this conflict with a fundamentally flawed assumption that Russia could be quickly isolated, economically devastated, and potentially even regime changed through a combination of sanctions and military pressure. The thinking was that Putin's government would collapse, Russia would fragment, and the West could then reshape the Eurasian landmass according to its interests. It was a fantasy, but it was a fantasy that a lot of very smart people in Brussels and Washington genuinely believed. The problem is that reality had other plans. The sanctions didn't collapse the Russian economy. In fact, Russia's economy has shown remarkable resilience. The ruble stabilized after initial volatility, Russian oil and gas found new markets in Asia, and Moscow demonstrated that it had spent the years since 2014 preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Russia had built up substantial foreign exchange reserves, developed alternative payment systems, strengthened ties with China and India, and crucially, had maintained much more of its industrial base than the West had. When push came to shove, Russia could still make things: artillery shells, tanks, missiles, all the unglamorous but essential material of modern warfare. Europe, on the other hand, discovered that it had made itself catastrophically dependent on Russian energy with no viable backup plan. When the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed, and we can have a whole separate conversation about who actually did that and why, Europe lost access to cheap, reliable natural gas. German industry, which had built its competitive advantage on affordable Russian energy, suddenly found itself paying 3, 4, sometimes 5 times more for liquefied natural gas shipped from halfway around the world. Chemical plants started shutting down, steel mills became uneconomical, energy-intensive manufacturing began relocating to other parts of the world where electricity costs weren't prohibitive. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience, this was deindustrialization in real time. And here's the cruel irony. Much of that industrial capacity is moving to the United States, which is now exporting expensive LNG to Europe at a substantial profit. So in a very real sense, American energy companies are benefiting from Europe's energy crisis, which was itself a consequence of the anti-Russia policy that Washington pushed Europe to adopt. It's a wealth transfer from European industry to American energy producers, wrapped in the language of solidarity and shared values. The European political establishment is starting to realize that they've been played. They went all in on a strategy that was never designed with European interests as the primary consideration. They severed economic ties with Russia, which had been mutually beneficial, in order to align with American geopolitical objectives. They imposed sanctions that hurt their own economies more than they hurt Russia's. They sent weapons and money to Ukraine, depleting their own military stockpiles and stretching their budgets. And now, just when the costs are really starting to bite, just when European publics are demanding accountability, just when the political consensus around this policy is starting to fracture, Washington is essentially saying, thanks for your support, but we're scaling back our commitment. You're welcome to continue on your own. This is what I mean when I say the power structure is shifting. For decades, the transatlantic alliance operated on the assumption that America and Europe were partners with aligned interests. But what we're seeing now is a much more transactional relationship, one where American policy is driven primarily by American interests, and European concerns are secondary at best. The problem for Europe is that they've structured their entire security architecture around American leadership. They've allowed their own military capabilities to atrophy because they assumed the American security umbrella would always be there. They've made strategic decisions, like the expansion of NATO, like the aggressive posture toward Russia, based on the assumption that Washington would always have their back. Now that assumption is being tested, and the results are not pretty. European leaders are scrambling to figure out how to fund continued support for Ukraine without American contributions. They're discovering that their own defense industrial bases are insufficient to meet the demand. They're facing domestic political pressure from populations that are increasingly skeptical about the costs of this conflict, and they're realizing that they have very little leverage in this situation. They can't force Washington to keep funding the war, They can't compel American weapons manufacturers to prioritize European orders. They can't even guarantee that their own political systems will remain stable enough to maintain the current policy trajectory. Let's talk about Ukraine itself for a moment, because the people who are going to suffer most from this American withdrawal are the Ukrainians. And I say this with no pleasure, because the Ukrainian people have been instrumentalized in a great power competition that was never really about their interests. They've been told that they're fighting for democracy, for European values, for the right of nations to choose their own destiny, and many Ukrainians genuinely believe that, and their courage and sacrifice deserve respect. But the harsh reality is that Ukraine has been a pawn in a much larger game, and now that the game isn't going the way Washington planned, the pawn is being abandoned. The Ukrainian military is exhausted. They've suffered enormous casualties, lost a generation of young men, and depleted the pool of trained soldiers. The economy is barely functioning, surviving only on external aid. The government is entirely dependent on Western support, both financial and political. And the military situation on the ground, despite what you might read in the mainstream press, is not favorable. Russia has adapted its tactics, learned from its early mistakes, and is grinding forward methodically. The much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensive failed to achieve its objectives. The Western wonder weapons, the Javelins, the HIMARS, the Leopard tanks, the F-16s, turned out not to be game-changers after all. War, it turns out, is still largely about industrial capacity, manpower, logistics, and strategic depth, and Russia has advantages in all of those areas. So, what happens to Ukraine if American funding dries up and European support proves insufficient? The most likely scenario is some kind of negotiated settlement, which is a diplomatic way of saying that Ukraine will have to accept less than what it wants. Russia will keep Crimea, that's almost certain. The status of the Donbas will be resolved in a way that reflects the reality on the ground, which favors Russia. Ukraine might get some security guarantees, but they'll be weaker than NATO membership, which was always a fantasy anyway. And the reconstruction of Ukraine, which will cost hundreds of billions of dollars, will become somebody else's problem, probably Europe's problem, which means it probably won't happen on the scale that's needed. This outcome was probably inevitable from the beginning, but acknowledging it requires admitting that the entire strategy was flawed, that the war was unwinnable on the terms that were set, and that all the blood and treasure expended were in pursuit of objectives that were never realistic. That's a very difficult thing for political leaders to admit, which is why they'll continue to use euphemisms and talk about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, even as they quietly reduce that support and prepare their populations for a very different outcome than the one they promised. Now let's zoom out even further and look at what this means for the global order. The post-World War II international system was built on American dominance, enforced through a combination of economic power, military might, and ideological appeal. The United States set the rules, and other countries mostly followed them because it was in their interest to do so, or because they had no choice. But that system depended on America having the resources and the will to maintain it. We're now seeing that both of those are in question. The resources are constrained by debt, by deindustrialization, by the erosion of the dollar's primacy, and by domestic political dysfunction. The will is constrained by a population that's increasingly skeptical of foreign interventions and by a political class that's more focused on internal battles than external commitments. This doesn't mean America is disappearing as a great power, but it does mean that the unipolar moment is over. We're moving into a multipolar world where other centers of power, China, Russia, India, regional blocs, have much more room to maneuver and much less reason to defer to Washington's preferences. This transition is going to be messy and dangerous because the existing hegemon never gives up its position peacefully. We're already seeing the consequences: proxy wars, economic coercion, alliance restructuring, and the breakdown of international institutions. The Ukraine conflict is just one theater in this broader transformation, but it's a particularly important one because it's exposing the limits of American power in a way that can't be hidden or spun away. Europe, for its part, is caught in the middle of this transition, and it's not clear that European leaders have the vision or the capability to navigate it successfully. They are too divided internally, too dependent on external powers, and too committed to a set of assumptions that no longer match reality. The European Union was supposed to be a counterweight to both American and Russian power, but it's turned out to be neither fish nor fowl. Not independent enough to chart its own course, not integrated enough to act decisively, and not strong enough to compel respect from rivals. What we're witnessing in real time is the unraveling of a geopolitical strategy and the exposure of the illusions that sustained it. The illusion that the West could dictate terms to Russia, the illusion that sanctions could substitute for military capability, the illusion that Europe and America had identical interests, the illusion that the global South would automatically line up behind Western leadership, the illusion that military aid could compensate for the lack of a realistic endgame. All of these illusions are being shattered against the hard rock of reality, and the costs are being paid by ordinary people who never signed up for this strategic gamble. So when you hear that the United States is rejecting European proposals for continued war funding, understand that this isn't just a budget dispute or a diplomatic disagreement. This is the visible manifestation of a much deeper shift in global power dynamics, in American strategic priorities, and in the viability of the Western alliance as it's been constituted for the past 7 decades. The old order is dying, and what replaces it is still very much in question. But one thing is certain, we're living through a historical inflection point, and the decisions being made right now will shape the world our children inherit. That's why it matters. That's why you need to understand what's really happening beneath the surface of the official narratives. And that's why we need to keep asking the uncomfortable questions that the establishment would prefer we ignore.